I've got Mr. Russ Jacob all the way from Albury as the project manager for the restoration of the DC2 at Albury to become Uiver. And Russ, I welcome you to the front here.
Thank you for the invitation to speak here tonight. It's great to be amongst aviation enthusiasts. Most of the talks I do are to service clubs and car clubs, and interesting enough, ladies groups. They seem to be fascinated by the whole restoration and the history of this whole thing. As David said, I'm the project manager, which basically means you're the bunny. I think you do all the work and get things organised, but I have to say it's a very pleasant job to see something forming up the way it is at the moment. The Uiver story starts, and Noel Jackling's here tonight to correct me on any errors I make on the talk. The Uiver story starts in 1934. The Mayor of Melbourne was looking around for an event, excuse me, to celebrate the centenary of Melbourne. And they come up with a number of ideas. They eventually come up with the idea of having an air race. The air race was going to be from Milton Hall or London to Melbourne, and they reached out to the Royal Aero Club in London. They did a lot of the heavy lift, and they wrote the rules and got things going from that end of the organisation. They needed funding, and they looked around, and they eventually found a gentleman by the name of Macpherson Robertson. Most people don't know who Macpherson Robertson is. He was known as the Chocolate King. He was a very wealthy individual. He was intensely interested in aviation, and he was an all-round good bloke. You'll never hear a bad word said about Mac. The thing was, he wasn't part of the establishment of Melbourne. He wasn't a sir, or didn't have a knighthood or anything like that. He was just an ordinary bloke, and he seemed to stay apart from the rest of the cliquey group that were getting around at that time. He agreed to put up £15,000 prize money. £10,000 was first prize. And the balance of the money was the other £5,000 was going to go to the runners-up. If you extrapolate that £10,000 in today's money, it was well over $1 million. And it was a lot of people become very, very interested in it. Anybody who was interested in aviation or could fly become interested. And the reason for that was we're coming out the back end of the Great Depression. It also served as a problem for them because there wasn't any money around. Mac also stipulated when he put the money up, it had to be called the Macpherson Robertson Air Race. And the second thing he stipulated was that it had to be conducted as safely as it could possibly be. He wrote a number of rules about that. They had to carry inflatable dinghies because they were flying over water. They had to have 3 days of food and a number of other things. So he was intensely interested that it was a safely run race. All the great names of aviation turned up: Kingsford Smith, Wiley Post, individuals like that were fairly well known within aviation. Out of these 60-odd members who applied to join the race, they ended up getting 20, mainly because of finance problems. Some of the competitors were Roscoe Turner. Roscoe was a fairly flamboyant individual. Yeah, so those are the brochures for the race. Next one. Macpherson Robertson, as well as the £10,000 prize money, there was a £600 solid gold trophy that went with it. There's a photograph it there with Macpherson Robertson. Each person that participated will also get a medallion to go with it. So Roscoe Turner was one of the first to apply. He got the money. He was a pretty flamboyant American. He'd been a lion tamer and a barnstormer. He'd worked in the movies, and he sort of made no bones about how he was going to win this race, which turns out he didn't. But and he was flying a brand new Boeing 247. It was a 10-seat passenger aircraft. It was the first all-metal airliner to go into production. So he was the first. This next group was the Dutch airline KLM, and they entered a brand new Douglas DC-2 that they'd only taken delivery of some months earlier. It was named the Uiver, and the captain was Cohen Parmentier and first officer were Jan Mole. KLM had an agenda with this. They already had an air route from the Netherlands to Jakarta, or Batavia was named in those days. They wanted to extend their air route through to Australia. And to push their case, they carried a crew of 4, 3 passengers and 27,000 pieces of mail. They were superbly organised, and they're sort of pretty well ready to go. Other individuals, Amy Johnson, now Amy Mollison, her and her husband Jim, they entered the race along with Jackie Cochran and a number of other people. There were 2 Australians in the race. The first was Ray Pera. Ray, I think most of us are aware of Ray Pera. He survived flying in New Guinea, which is an accolade within itself during that time. Ray had participated in the 1920 air race in which Ross and Keith Smith won. It took him 7 months to complete the race, but he eventually got there. His luck wasn't much better in the 1934 race. It only took him 2 months this time, and he eventually finished. The other Australian was a young bloke, 21 years old, Jimmy Melrose from Glenelg in South Australia. Jimmy was a bit of an exceptional case. He'd already made a name for himself. He'd broken the record for flying around Australia. Oh, it's working. There's Roscoe Turner. There's Amy Johnson and her husband, Jim Mollison, the Uiver crew. Scott and Black were the eventual first place winners. Jackie Cochran, of course. And good old Ray Pera, looking pretty relaxed. Jimmy Melrose, he was a bit of a special case. He'd made a name for himself with breaking a few records. He only had 200 hours in his logbook, which is fairly remarkable considering you were flying against people with thousands of hours. What set him apart again was instead of shipping his aircraft to England, he actually flew the course in reverse to England. Once he got there, he turned around and competed in the race. The other exceptional thing is that Jimmy was the only competitor to fly solo, 200 hours, and he flew solo. It means he had to fly, navigate, and maintain the aircraft. You have a look at his aircraft, there's a whopping great big fuel tank in behind the seat there, looks like a 44, loaded up. Jimmy did really well. He came 6th overall in the race, which is a pretty remarkable feat for someone so young with so inexperienced, etc. The British, being the British, decided that there should be an Englishman flying an English-built aircraft that should win the race. And de Havilland set about building an aircraft specifically for the race. Of course, the aircraft was a DH-88, the Common. I think just everybody here would be familiar with. They built 3 aircraft. There was a green one that was purchased by an Australian. I think his name was, I can't think of his name now. An Australian, he got sick and couldn't compete in the race. The second one was all black. It was called Black Magic. It was flown by Jim and Amy Johnson, or Amy Mollison as she was then. And the third one was painted bright red. It was Grosvenor House. And these aircraft were very fast, very sleek. It's the Uiver on the starting line. It's Grosvenor House. I think you'll all agree it's a pretty sleek, fast-looking aircraft, considering it was built in 1934, and it was built in a record time. They were still working on the aircraft the night before the race. They were still modifying it. Apparently, the thing was an absolute dog to fly. You couldn't trim it. You had to fly it every inch of the way. It had some really nasty characteristics with wingtip stall on landings, and it was, yeah, the winners eventually that got to Australia, they looked like they'd been dragged under a bus for the whole way. They really suffered. So that was Grosvenor House. It was the eventual winner. This is Black Magic and the green one, and there's I'm not sure what it is behind there, but there's an image of the scale of the aircraft. You can see the DC-2 was a pretty large aircraft, and there's some quite small things. Apparently, some of the aircraft weren't in particularly good flying condition either. It was a wing and a prayer job, as we understand it, a wing and a prayer. The race was from London, Milton Hall, with stops along the way. There were compulsory stops at Baghdad, Islamabad, Darwin, and Charleville. They had to stop. They could fly past some of the others. Some of the smaller aircraft had refueling points along the way there. The race started on the 20th of October 1934 at 6:30 in the morning. Aircraft were flagged off at 45-second intervals. There were 21 aircraft that took up the race position. The Comets very quickly took the lead. They did really well. Right from the beginning, things started to go wrong for competitors. Poor old Ray Pera got to France and had mechanical problems, radiator problems, and he was stuck there for quite some time. There was one crash in which the competitors died. One other unfortunate couple flew into the wrong country. They were promptly arrested and thrown in jail for 2 or 3 days. There was a series of accidents all the way through. In the meantime, Grosvenor House was doing really well. A picture of Darwin in 1934. Grosvenor House was doing really well. They flew the Timor Sea. And one of the things that comes out when you read some of the competitors' stories, their big fear was flying over this large stretch of water called the Timor Sea. And it was rumoured to be full of man-eating sharks. And quite a few of them were quite concerned about this whole thing. As it turned out, the 10 aircraft that finished the race, they all made it across the Timor Sea. Grosvenor House ended up, it overflew the finish line at Flemington Racecourse and went on to land at Rathlavitton, taking first place, the 10,000 pounds, the trophy. And they set a new record of 70 hours, a little bit over 70 hours. The remarkable part about Grosvenor House is it's still flying today. When you consider that aircraft was built in 1934 with all timber, it's still flying as part of the Shuttleworth collection. There's some very nice videos on YouTube that show it flying. I was talking to a chap in England just recently. He'd just been out and he'd visited the restoration work being done on Black Magic, the second DH-88. They're making really good progress. They hope to get it to the point where it flies. But he said the other remarkable thing is that they have the original set of drawings for DH-88s there in the original wooden drawers. So another really important piece of aviation history has been retained. In the meantime, the Uiver had done pretty well. It flown the Timor Sea. It landed at Darwin and flew on to the next compulsory stop, Charleville. It got to Charleville, and we've recently had a book written by Parmentier translated. And Parmentier was pretty hot under the collar about his reception at Charleville. He wasn't allowed to land until he got a green signal. And then the organisers there fooled him around. He flew circus for quite a long time before they finally give him permission to land. When he landed at the wrong spot away from the fuel, so then he had to taxi the aircraft up to the other end of the airport or the airfield to fuel up. While they were there, they got a weather report, and the weather report wasn't particularly good. They would forecast thunderstorms, etc. And Parmentier, the captain, wanted to go ahead, or decided to go ahead. We have video footage of First Officer Mole. That was the video was made, or the film was made in the 1980s, and he's still hot under the collar that Parmentier decided to continue with that race. And there appears to be been a bit of friction between the first officer and the captain there. But regardless, they took off at 8 o'clock from Charleville and flew into what was known to be very bad weather. As they approached the Riverina area, they became totally lost in cloud. Didn't know where they were. And Parmentier, or the crew decided that they'd fly towards the coast and follow the coast around. As they got closer to the mountains, Parmentier mentions we heard loud thumps against the side of the fuselage, and initially they weren't quite sure what was happening. What was happening was the propellers were icing, and they were throwing pieces of ice against the fuselage of the aircraft. Moll, in his interview, also mentioned that despite being at full power, they were losing height. So the aircraft was obviously fairly well iced on at that point. So they did the right thing and they flew back to the west. At this point, the Royal Ivor was in a real bad way. They were lost, they were low on fuel. It was after midnight. And despite being able to contact the race coordinators through Morse code, they couldn't read anything because of the electrical storm that was going on. So they flew back, and they obviously at some point flew over Albury, and they mentioned that they flew over a small town. They could see the city lights, but they couldn't work out where it was. So they turned south and they headed towards Melbourne. As they headed towards Melbourne, the weather deteriorated further. And all the time, the race coordinators, they had people that had rung in from around the area to say they heard a large aircraft flying overhead. The race organisers were sending a message, "You're over Yakandanda," and the radio operator, Van Brugge, only got one word out of that whole message, and that was Yakandanda. So they basically knew where they were at that point. So they flew a reciprocal course back to what they thought was going to be Albury. As they got closer to Albury, in Parmentier's book, he said we could see the town lights, but the lights kept going on and off all the time. We couldn't quite work out what was going on. And what was happening, the local electrical engineer had got out with someone who knew Morse code, and they were signalling in Morse code the word Albury, A-L-B-U-R-Y. So the lights were coming on and off, and they eventually sort of worked that out. At the same time, the announcer at 2CO broke all the rules, risked his job to open up Radio 2CO, and they broadcast a message to anybody that was up, and bearing in mind this was after midnight, anybody who had a car to travel out to the racecourse where they lined up the cars with their headlights on to form a makeshift runway. At some point, Parmentier and Mole saw these cars lined up, and initially they weren't quite sure what it was. They dropped a couple of flares to light up the whole area, and they worked out it was a racecourse, or what they called a donut-shaped area. So once they got their bearings and worked out what the obstructions were that they'd be flying over or into, they flew a circuit and landed on Albury Racecourse at 1:17 in the morning. Recently, I was talking to John Love, and I think some of you would know John Love, fairly well known. He had the Lockheed 12 ABH. It's on the newsletter, I think. ABH, and he was talking about how they reenacted that flight. And John put his Lockheed 12 down on Albury Racecourse, and he said it was the scariest thing I've ever done in my life. It was so short. And he said, I've got to take my hats off to these blokes. They put that massive great aircraft down on Albury Racecourse in the middle of the night. Remarkable feat of aviation. Parmentier went on to say it was the best landing he ever made in his life. And considering his life depended on it, I suppose you would say that, wouldn't you? So anyhow, the aircraft was down safe and sound at 1:17 in the morning. They took the crew into town, and the crew were able to talk to their families over telephone. They talked to the race coordinators and a number of other people. They had a little bit of sleep, and first thing at first light, they got up and went back out to the race course. The Royal Ivor was bogged to its axles at this point. So tug of war was a very popular sport in those days, and the group of men got together with heavy ropes and they dragged the Ivor back to the southern boundary of Albury Racecourse. They unloaded everything they could get out of the aircraft, seats and passengers and everything else to make it as light as they could. And with just the pilot and the first officer on board, they attempted a takeoff. Their first attempt didn't work out, so they taxied back and pointed the aircraft in a more northeasterly direction, and they finally got the thing off the ground, narrowly missing trees at the end of the racecourse. Another interesting fact that come out of this was they had to dismantle a fence that belonged to the coursing club. And the coursing club decided because they pulled the fence down, they'd send a bill to the Dutch government to refund. So I don't think that went down particularly well either. Anyhow, a little under an hour, the Ivor overflew the finish line at Flemington, went on to Laverton. A reasonably famous picture of the Ivor. You see how wet it is there. So all the mail and baggage and a lot of onlookers there. We assume this is taxiing back to the southern end of the race course to have its second attempt at taking off. and landing at Rathbase Laverton. The Uiver had the option of taking out second place in the speed event or first place in the handicap event. They chose the second option there, and I think they got £2,000 for their trouble. The crew were somewhat heroes in the country at that time as they gradually started to, the competitors started to arrive in Melbourne. Melbourne welcomed them, and you can see by the crowd there the sort of reception they got. The Uiver crew were in Melbourne for a little bit under a week, and they got into the Uiver and decided and flew back to Holland. When they got back to Holland, they were treated as real heroes. We understand the Dutch government gave the residents of Holland a day off, which had never been done before. They were awarded the Orange Nassau, which was the highest award that a civilian could have in Holland, and there were postage stamps printed, etc. And we have anecdotal evidence that there were a number of newborn babies christened Ivor J, which means little stork. And I'm not too sure how the people that got that name felt about the whole thing, but that's how the story goes. Almost 2 months to the day, the Uiver was flying a run from Holland to Batavia, or Jakarta as it is now. They were flying over Iraq, and they flew into another storm. This time they didn't make it out the other side, and they crashed at 2 wells, totally destroying the aircraft. The passengers and crew all died at the scene. The aircraft was only less than 6 months old. Considering the short time that it flew, is probably the most famous DC-2 that most people seem to know a little bit about it, perhaps after Bungana, which of course some of you will be aware that what is left of Bungana is now residing in Albury as a sort of a fifth wheeler, belongs to Darryl Gibbs. Very obviously, we have a DC-2 in the hangar, and it's not the Uiver. Our aircraft has its own story. It was originally purchased by Eastern Airlines, who travelled under the banner or promoted themselves under the banner of the Great Silver Fleet. They purchased 10 DC-2s, and this one we know, or we believe, flew the New York to Florida run. It was known by colloquially as the Florida Flyer. Just recently, we got a photograph of our aircraft overflying New York in 1935. We're pretty darn happy to have this. We also have a little bit of footage of DC-2s flying that we believe was part of a promotion by Eastern Airlines. So we know, other than that, we know almost nothing about its time with Eastern Airlines. In 1941, it was, along with another 8 DC-2s, it was purchased for use by the RAAF in the Second World War. It was issued the tail number A3011. It was also given a civilian tail number, BHCRE. And the outline of the sign writing of those details, we could still see them on the aircraft before we polished all the skins. We did keep one panel that has A3011 on it. It was originally based at Point Cook, and it was used to train radio operators, and we think perhaps navigators as well. In 1941, it was flown to Essendon, which is a major maintenance facility for the Air Force, and they installed it was also used as a jump plane. We believe that picture was taken over Canberra or around Canberra area. 1942, it was flown to Essendon. They installed that large cargo door, and they were used for transporting engines between the various maintenance facilities. It had a gantry here that they could disassemble and put inside the aircraft so they could unload the engines. In March of 1945, the Uiver, or A3011, took off from Parafield in Adelaide. On the climb out, it lost an engine. The pilots turned back towards the airstrip, and when they touched down, the right-hand undercarriage collapsed. The aircraft sustained damage from the ground loop, and it never flew again. In 1946, Sid Marshall purchased A3011. They disassembled it and loaded it onto trucks. The fuselage and the wings made it to Sydney, to Sid Marshall's yard, but the wing centre section, intact with fuel tanks, landing gear and everything else, didn't make it. It never got out of Adelaide. The the truck broke down and it was offloaded outside a service station. It stood there for, I think, 12 or 13 years. We have a picture of it, which I didn't put in there. There's a picture of Pegasus, the Mobil Gas logo, sitting up there against the thing. The owner, despite being paid rent to store the thing, when he sold the service station, he sold the wing centre section for scrap. Sid was apparently vastly annoyed by this, and I'm not too sure what action he took there. That's a picture of our aircraft at Bankstown. Basically a wreck. That gutted the thing pretty well. When Sid bought it, he didn't get the engines with it, but they'd gutted the aircraft to keep the other DC-2s flying. In 1979, the Albury West Rotary Club, looking around for an event to celebrate an anniversary of Rotary, and John Love and Joe Drage flew up to Sydney to Bankstown, and talking to John just recently, he said there were 4 DC-2s there that were owned by Sid Marshall. The Rotary Club bought this one for, I believe, $2,000. It was shipped back to Albury, and it was reassembled in a big building on the Lincoln Causeway. For the first time ever, it was painted silver frost, and it was given the Uiver livery. It then went on to be mounted on the poles outside Albury Terminal. I think many of you would either have seen it or know about it. It spent from 1980 to 2002 on the poles. During that time, it deteriorated quite badly. The Albury City Council decided that it was dangerous, and they took it down from the poles and they moved it over to the southeastern, also the southwestern part of the airstrip. It sat there for another 14 years while the council argued what to do with it. And it was quite obvious from, we have all the correspondence from that period, it was quite obvious from reading the documentation, it was just a millstone around their neck. They wanted to get rid of it. They put it up for auction, up for sale. I think Steve Ferris offered $1,000 or something, and most of the other museums said, oh, look, we'll take it off your hands. Albury residents weren't having any of this. This is our Uiver and it's not leaving town. And eventually they got a couple of people, aviation enthusiasts, Peter Moll and Evo Moll and Nicole Thomas, some of you may be aware of Nicole. They got together and approached the council to purchase the aircraft, which they did for $1. They wrote a 300-page conservation management plan, and they took ownership of the aircraft. It was moved, disassembled. It still sat on the airstrip for a few more years while they sort of got their act together. And eventually it was Prole Uiver as she stood just before they started disassembling it. It was in a fairly bad way. At some point, someone pulled the hatch over the cockpit off it, allowed birds to get in and a lot of water to get in, and did an enormous amount of damage to the poor old aircraft, which you'll see later. Eventually it was disassembled, and we moved into a very small hangar where the paint was stripped off it and a little bit of work was done on it, but not a whole lot. In 2019, we were able to purchase a large hangar on the Albury Airport, a 48 by 30 metre hangar, which was to become our new home. Albury City Council gave us a community loan of $300,000 or $330,000 to purchase the hangar. And over the next 3 or 4 months, we gradually moved our equipment into the hangar. That's our hangar prior to us moving in there. It's quite a large aircraft. It was rumoured to be able to hold a 737, but seeing as how a 737 has a wingspan of 33 metres and the building is only 30 metres wide, I think that's probably not quite correct. It was originally built for an aviation spray painting organisation. They only lasted a few years in there and they moved out. The owner then put it up for lease or sale. It stood there unoccupied for something like 14 years. The problem being that it was within the confines of the Albury Airport and you can only conduct aviation work within the confines. Make an excellent engineering shop, but the council wouldn't give approval with it. So we turned up and one of our members approached the owner and made a ridiculously low offer for it, which they accepted on provision that they'd get tax benefits from the balance of what they wanted for it. So in March 2020, we moved the aircraft with a fair amount of difficulty. We transported it over to the new hangar. It was only 200 or 300 metres, and set it up in the hangar. Gradually moved our plant and equipment over. In March 2020, COVID struck and the whole project was closed down for 4 months. Although some of us continued to work on infrastructure within the building. That was taken towards the end of March. We've got everything in place within the hangar, and the work ceased, of course, because of COVID. The problem we had was we had plenty of volunteers, but not one single person had any experience in restoring aircraft. We didn't have any. We had one lamey, but it turns out lameys don't know much about restoration. We had no sheet metal workers, and so we had a pretty well uphill battle to work out how we're going to do this. Thank goodness Ashley Briggs came to the rescue. Some of us spent time with Ash in his hangar down there and learnt some of the basic points of restoring aircraft. Ash, I might add, has been enormous help all the way through with information and advice. This is what it looked like in the tail section, and it was probably one of the worst frames. There were a few more that were worse than that, but a little bit further forward. So that was what we're up against. And having no experience, it's a pretty formidable task to start to repair something like that. This is what we eventually ended up, the same area after restoration. Over the next 12 months, we spent a lot of time learning. We had a very, very large scrap bin that filled up very quickly. And by the end of the first 12 months, we were doing really good. We were turning out really reasonably high quality work. When we took on this project, it was agreed that we would restore the aircraft using best aviation practice and using aviation grade materials, which we've up to this point been able to do. That's the tail section. The fin screws onto that section before and after. Skins. The skins on the aircraft, we've been able to restore 95% of the skins. Considering the aircraft is 90 years old, we think it's a pretty remarkable feat. There's been an enormous amount of work in that. We strip the paint off the inside, we scour out all the corrosion, and everything has corrosion at some point. It might be very fine corrosion on the skins. We polish all that out. A typical panel, a typical skin panel, say 8 foot, I'm talking imperial here because the aircraft is built in imperial and we all understand imperial. Younger people don't quite understand feet and inches. So a typical panel of about 8 foot by 8 inches would take probably a day and a half to polish it to the point where it starts to look really good. One of our volunteers, he spends endless hours just polishing. We have 4,000 clicos. At times we run out. That's the rear section looking towards the tail. Some of the frames, nearly every one of those frames, because the water is in a tail dragger, the water gets in, runs down the back, and it pools along the bottom of the frames there. So out of the 23 frames that are in there, we've had to rebuild the bottom of every single one of them. That's a cockpit area. That was all that was left in the aircraft. The control columns, no wheels. Someone decided they needed that quadrant a lot more than we did and pinched the bloody thing. Why people would do that is way beyond it. The problem is I know who's got it. He denies knowing anything about it. That's the prior to restoration, and this is restoration. It's not quite finished yet, but you get the general idea. You can see the repairs. In the bottom. It's been cut out there, back up to that section up there. So we rebuilt it, that section back through there. The wing centre section. it took us 2 years to strip that down. There's skin upon skin upon skin. It's of course the strongest part of the aircraft. It houses the fuel tanks, the engines and the landing gear. And we've currently got it down to number 3 spar. Our problem is we're having trouble getting extrusion for the spar caps just at the moment. Won't go into the problems we're having with that, but we can't. You can normally get this material made in the US, but the US suppliers have said to us, there's a supply chain problem and a staffing problem. We can't give you a date. So sort of held the project up a bit. The cargo door, we finally got all that together, and the actual door fits in there, which has made us pretty darn happy. That's the aircraft in its current state as of a couple of weeks ago. We're 95% complete. We've just got skins to go on the bottom and a bit of riveting around there, and we've finished the fuselage, or as much as we can do at the moment. Picture of our props. I'll go through this fairly quickly. Overall picture of our restoration area, our fabrication section. We have a gentleman rebuilding, we have 3 engines. We have a gentleman who's rebuilding that engine. Tom's done a remarkably good job. He's fastidious to the point of being a pain in the butt, to say the least. But he's doing a remarkably good job. That's our paint stripping and scouring area. We have our spray booth has been set up with a spray booth with filters and things like that. So we do, most of our spraying gets done in there. We've got heat lamps and things to dry things out. Our crew, 1 or 2 there have departed the scene since then. There's been a couple of new ones coming. Our plan eventually is to build this. That's our existing hangar there, and the whole theme of this building, if you look at that section, it's the landing gear, the fuselage there, the 2 props, and it's built on an aviation theme. Before COVID, it was priced at 1.6 million. It's probably 2.6 million now, and by the time we build it, if we ever get to do that, it's probably going to be 5.6 million, something we're working on. I mentioned earlier that we have a book by K.D. Parmentier, the captain of the Uiver. We were gifted this by a gentleman in Spain. The book is 320 pages with a lot of images in it, photographs, drawings and things. It was in Dutch and we couldn't read the damn thing, and it frustrated the hell out of us. So I got upset about scanning it and running it through translation software. And if anybody's used translation software, it's not particularly good. It kept calling the Uiver the liver or the coffin, and it made some whole paragraphs were almost unreadable. Apparently, there are a lot of Dutch words that just don't translate. So we found a gentleman in Holland who translated the whole book into English for us. Did a remarkably good job. His name's Henry Decker. He's been an enormous source. Anything we have in Dutch, we send to him and he just translates it for us. The book is at the point ready to go to the printers. It's a really good, this is a commercial, by the way. It's a really good read. It's written by a pilot, a lot of technical information on the aircraft, and particularly on navigation in the 1930s. But it's all written in layman's terms. It's just a real good book to read. And if you want a good read, buy this book. It's just excellent. It'll be released on our 90th anniversary dinner, and it's about $29.95, we think, at this point. So it's the story of the Uiver, the great race or part of the Uiver, straight from the horse's mouth. That's our 90th anniversary logo. I thought I had a few more. I think we've got the wrong one there, but never mind, not a problem. In October this year is the 90th anniversary of the landing of the Uiver at Albury. We're having a major event. We're trying to get the RAF roulettes down. We've got a number of warbird pilots who have agreed to do a bit of a fly past for us. And got a lot of other interesting things happening. So if you're around in October, come and visit Albury. we'll give you a good time. Any questions?
Where'd you get your centre section from? Dave. Enjoyed your talk immensely. Where'd you get your centre section from?
The
Centre section? You said the original one was destroyed.
Yeah.
Sold for scrap.
Our aircraft, serial number 1286, was 26th off the assembly line, is made up of a composite of bits and pieces. The right wing we know isn't the original wing because it ground looped, and the right-hand wing, when the undercarriage collapsed, would have sustained damage. The left-hand wing, we're not sure. The wing centre section is from another aircraft. So it's a composite build. But we still call it serial number 1286, despite only being half of the components from the original aircraft.
You mentioned about
Yeah.
four DC2s in, I don't get that, four DC2s
Yeah, they do.
in Sydney. In Sydney, right. What state of preservation are they at?
One's at Moorabbin.
Yep.
Steve Ferris in Sydney, I'm not sure of the status, but he was restoring it. But I understand that he sort of lost interest and is trying to offload it. I'm not sure about that. The fourth one was shipped out to Holland and has been fully restored and is now part of the Dutch Transport Museum. We have contact with them. They've sent us some really nice photos of that aircraft. So there are only 6, despite what people would tell you, there's only 6 DC2s left in the world. 2 of them are airworthy, one in the Washington Museum or the Seattle Museum, the Boeing Museum. It flies, or it's capable of flying, but it doesn't fly anymore. The other one is in Holland, and it's done up in the Uiver livery. It was the one that flew out here in the 1980s, some of you may remember. So there's 6 that we know of at this point, and the four in Australia, which is fairly good. And of course, Bungana. I think some of you will be familiar with Bungana. It was the first DC2 to be brought in for a commercial airline in 1930s. It was eventually scrapped. Someone bought the aircraft and they turned the fuselage into a 5th wheeler. Darryl Gibbs in Albury has bought the thing. It's currently jammed in his front yard, and he's not quite sure what he was doing. I think he just enjoys owning a piece of aviation history.
Just a query that, not a query, perhaps you could enlighten us as just what happened. We all know the Comet flew across the finishing line at Flemington. Now I know the whole 20 aircraft didn't do that, but the thing that I just liked, if you could throw any light on, Uiver was in the end of the race. And where was it heading for in Melbourne? Because it obviously wasn't going to Flemington to fly over, being 1 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, no. The aircraft, it landed at midnight or after midnight in Albury. Next morning, they launched, I think, about 10 o'clock. Noel might correct me on that. I think they launched about 10 o'clock and they overflew the finishing line at Flemington Racecourt an hour later and went on to land at Laverton.
But they wouldn't have done that, of course, had they proceeded, had they not diverted into Albury, because if the weather had been better and they had not had to go into Albury, they'd have arrived in Melbourne at middle of the night though, wouldn't they?
Yeah. I'm not sure how they'd handle that, but considering the bloke put it down on a very small race course in the middle of Albury, I don't think he would have had a problem with Laverton. And the race organised was certainly well aware of, once he got airborne again, they were well aware of him. The time that he spent, the 10 hours that he spent on the ground at Albury actually contributed towards the race time. So he actually, I think he did 90 odd hours was the flight time of the aircraft. If you take the 10 hours off, it was actually about 80 hours. I may be corrected on that.
There's another sideline too, Captain Parmentier. Was he captain on the Constellation that crashed in Shannon
Same
with the
gentleman.
gold.
Yes.
Yeah, no, he died. The captain, just to fill you in on the crew, Parmentier died flying a Constellation in Scotland. He hit power lines and died there. Mole went on to become the commandant, Dutch word or some deviation of commandant, a fairly high authority within KLM. He died of, we believe, natural causes. He was well over 80. The radio operator, and this is all thanks to Noel's book. We recently, Noel released a book on a lot of this information. Van Brugge, the radio operator, he was shot down by the Nazis during the war. I understand it. And Prins, the mechanic, I think he lived to an old age as well from them.
Okay.
Hey, it's John McCulloch from Moorabbin. Just a couple of obscurities about the DC2. There were originally 3 DC2s entered in the McRobertson race, and obviously the KLM one was the only one that started. But Roscoe Turner's original entry was a DC2, and he spent a lot of time haggling with the organisers to change to a 247.
Really?
And I think you could only imagine that if he'd have treated the DC2 the same way he treated the 247, which was, to fuel it to the gills, and there were limitations on the 247, which meant that he couldn't fly directly between the checkpoints. But if you imagine a fully fueled up DC2 flying higher, faster, and further than a 247, I think there's a fair chance that if he'd have stuck with a DC2, he'd have won the race. And the other one was, I think it was entry number 4, which was Harry Lyon, who was famous from the Southern Cross flight with Kingsford Smith.
Oh, yeah.
So it's possible that 3 DC2s could have started in the race, and I reckon they probably would have run first, second, and third. If I don't know in which particular order, but I reckon there's a fair chance they would have cleaned up if they'd have started. Only a speculation on my part.
Yeah. Considering the Uiver had 10-hour stop at Albury, which counted, they certainly would have won if they were in the same team. The interesting thing about the 247, they only built 76 of them. They weren't a commercial success. The DC2 went on to be an enormous success, and from that grew the DC3. They built over 11,000 DC2s, and if you count the ones built in, I think, Japan, and I think they built some in Russia, there's something like 14,000 DC2s were built during that time, which is pretty remarkable for an aircraft. You have to say the DC2 was a leader it was the beginning of modern aviation transport. It was fast, it was heated, it didn't vibrate, it had rubber mounted seats, it had a hostie, and it was the beginning of air transport as we know it today. But interesting, your comments there. KLM originally entered, I think, 3 aircraft in it, and the DC2 finally made it off the chopping block and got going. But interesting that was, you learn something new every time you talk to someone on these. Well done.
Maybe we have some questions online. Are there any questions online that people would like to ask? No? Drawn a blank?
All good.
I might hand the microphone back to Dave.
Thank you very much.
Just add on.
Hang on. Back to Noel.
The question was asked about the flying over Flemington on the way to Laverton. The Uiver left Albury at either 9:54 or 9:55 a.m., according to which version you look at, and it got to Flemington at 10:52. There's a radio interview on Radio 3AW, which is probably nonsense, but it claims that there were some boys playing cricket in I think it was Fairfield Park or Fairbairn Park out in Ascot Vale, and the Uiver allegedly didn't know where Flemington was, so they dropped in and disturbed the boys playing cricket and asked them the way to go to Flemington. They then went past Flemington at 10:58 a.m. and through the pylons. I don't know what arrangements were made for night time. I don't know whether John happens to know that, but I don't. But as it turned out, they did go through at daytime, and then they arrived at RWF at Leverton at 11:07 a.m.
All good. Thank you very much.
Just to close off, Russ, thank you very much for your talk tonight. And every time I hear about Uiver and the race, there's always something new turns up. A little snippet here, a little snippet there, and we got a couple from John tonight and from Russ as well. And I feel you could be amalgamating all of the books, and you have a very big book on the race and the aircraft and the personalities and the side issues as well. Thank you once again.
Anybody who's in Albury, if you're coming through Albury, we're open on Wednesdays and Saturdays. If you come through and we're not open, my phone number's on the front door. Give me a call. I'm very happy to come out and show you. All you got to do is put a donation in the donation tower, and I'll be very happy to give you a personal guided tour through the hangar.
And you said not gold coins, but folding, I think is a better expression there.
We'll take anything.
Sounds to me good.
Russ, you take memberships, don't you? Is that a way of subscribing?
Not at this stage. If you'd like to learn more about the Uiver, we have a very good web page. We have a very active Facebook page. And if you go to our the front page of our website, if you just Google Uiver Restoration, down the bottom you can subscribe to our monthly magazine. We have a retired journalist does it. Andy does a great job of it, and you can learn more about what's happening out on the site.
Once again, Russ, thank you very much for coming all the way from Albury. Marianne, I hope both of you enjoy being in our city for a while. I know you've been here and more than once before, but good to have you here. And once again, I do thank you very much for coming to Melbourne and being our guest speaker tonight. Great.
Enjoyed your talk, Russ. 1984 was the 50th anniversary of that flight. And there was a reenactment flight organised from Holland to Laverton with an American registered DC-2. On the 31st of January, 1984, I was at work and I get a phone call from Bob Fripp. And he said, David, if you can be at Moorabbin Airport this afternoon, we're flying to Albury to meet the DC-2. So I grabbed my son, we went to Moorabbin Airport, and Keith Meggs flew Bob Fripp, me and Robert from Moorabbin to Albury. We got there before the DC-2 arrived. I got a series of photographs taken on that day, which I hope people may find interest in view of the fact that you've given a talk. And this is 50 years after that flight. So if you want to see it, I'm quite happy to show what I recorded on that day.
Don't go away yet. Dave Anderson is on stage.
So not only did I go to Albury to greet this DC-2 coming in, but then on the 5th of February, it flew from, that's the one, that's the first one. Okay, so we'll start off with that in a moment. And that was the 31st of January, 1984, it arrived at Albury. And it stayed there for a number of days. On the 5th of February, it then flew from Albury to Laverton. And on the same day, it went Laverton-Essendon. So I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment. So we were fortunate enough to get out on the airstrip as it flew across, as it arrived. Next, we'll get through these fairly quickly. Just next button, next. Oh. This is the first time I'd seen a DC-2 fly. Okay, so that's touchdown. Next, zipping past. And this is a fairly significant event because it's 50 years since the Uiver had actually been there. Next, taxiing in. Notice it's got the red registration on top of the wings. Next, I tried to get the other DC-2 in the background. I'm not sure whether I did get it when it was still up on the pole. We were in a vehicle that was going along beside as this is taxiing. We were next to it. Next, they parked it on the grass. There's a big crowd of people, as you can see, that attended. Next, this is in the afternoon. There's the DC-2. There it is. That's your one over the back there. So there's the two in the one photograph. Next, it's about to pull up. Next, the red carpet comes out, Uiver on the nose. Now, this is American, even though it's carrying PH registration, it's actually an American registered aircraft, which now lives in Holland. N39165 was its registration. Next. Now, this is the crew and passengers getting out at Albury. Now, the sun's in the wrong area. I couldn't do anything about that. So, next. Pilot, co-pilot. Next. Another crewman. Next. Tail. You just make out the American registration there. I don't know whether in the back you can see it at all, but there it is. Next. Now, you had a photograph of the Uiver crew, original, similar, standing in front of the Uiver at Albury. Well, here is the 50 years later crew standing in front of the replica Uiver at Albury. Next. They're all jovial, jolly. Next. The Mayor of Albury. And I don't know who the other VIPs are. Next. That was it sitting. You see the sun was getting low in the sky. The shadows were being cast long. Next. Okay, so that's it at Albury, 31st of January. 5th of February, it flies then down to Laverton. And Phil Weber, your photos are about to appear. Next. At Laverton. Oh, right, okay. I knew it was coming down. So I'll get really smart. I knew I was going to go to Laverton and then up to Essendon. So where did I position myself? I went to Flemington. I stood on the bridge over the Maribyrnong River and I thought they would just have to fly over Flemington all the way, but they didn't do it. It would have been the photograph of the century if I could have got it coming over Flemington. So I stood there on the bridge and I missed it. And I then went out to Essendon. But you were obviously at Laverton and well, these are attributed to you. So next. So that's it arriving at Laverton on the 5th of February, 1984. Next. 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 Welcome, Uiver in Melbourne. Next. Okay, at Essendon. So I went and positioned myself on the observation deck at Essendon and it did one. I came from the north, did one run along the top of the runway and around and then came into land. Next. About to touch down. Next. Touching down, the reservoir there. Next. Bit of a crowd there. Next. 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 A little yellow car, of course, obviously. Next. 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 And it stayed there for a few days and then it went on up to Sydney. I've got photographs of it at Sydney that I hadn't taken. And then went back to, I think, Holland. Next. So it looks just like the original, but 50 years later. Next. Okay, and I got in on the 7th, 2 days later, I actually got in it and was able to photograph the cockpit. So that's the end of my addendum to your talk 50 years later on the Uiver. What I'm about to do now, changing subjects, is I'm about to make an official announcement. After 48 years, my cockpit's going to be up for sale. Thanks to my very long-term good friend here, Peter Fitton. He's put it together for me a couple of advertisements that will start to appear in various publications. Next. That's the first one. I'll let you read it. There was a 37 Squadron aircraft. I'm so tickled pink, Peter. And next. So this is the official announcement of my passing it on to, hopefully, someone who will treasure it as much as I have over all these years. Okay, gentlemen, I hope you that sort of rounded off this evening, and thanks. I enjoyed your talk.